Hey everyone, I hope you're having a good week. I just wanted to check in with a couple of sort of notes about things upcoming before we get into the video for today. So as you know, and as I can't believe, we are almost done with the term. That's absolutely wild to me. I know I say this every term, and I know I say this literally all the time, but this is really weird to me. It feels like we've been doing this both forever and also for no time at all. So it's a very strange time dilation feeling. We are living in an alternate universe and everything is weird. But we still have biology, so that's cool. So just a couple of things. We talked a little bit in a video on Tuesday about what your project is going to look like. We're finally getting to that point where we're going to be sort of really hunkering down and working on this. So for these last 3 weeks, we're really going to be going pretty light on the content and just sort of wrapping up with these concepts of sustainability and environmental biology. But otherwise giving you lots of time to work on those projects. So now's the time, if you are missing work, to go, try to catch up on that and come talk to me. If there's work you're missing that you're having some trouble getting in, I'd like you to contact me and let me know that you're having some difficulties there. So the presentation deal is, I know this is like fairly complicated sounding. I promise it won't be once we get to it. But I've already started getting some kind of questions from the group. And so if you have questions about what this is going to look like, let me know so I can answer those for you. But to sort of recap a little bit, we are doing presentations. Your presentation will be about 15 minutes plus a time for Q&A. So I'm asking for about a 30-minute time commitment from you. And I'm going to be having you guys sign up for individual times that you can present. And so there'll be multiple people presenting at the same time over Zoom. And of course, this can be done asynchronously if needed. But that is going to be held on Thursday, the 28th during your class period, and then Monday, the 1st during like your final exam block. So these are all times that are carved out for this class. Certainly if you find that that time is just not going to happen, like Miss Finney, I cannot carve out 30 minutes in that time frame, just talk to me. We can probably arrange for it to be asynchronous. I don't think that will be an issue at all. And then the other thing I'm asking of you for this final project is, you guys are going to have an audience from Bio 500. In return, I would like you to attend the Bio 500 presentations. So they will be attending yours and you will be attending theirs. They have the same type of deal. So 15 minutes plus time for a Q&A, that's their project also. And I think you'll find their project's really interesting because they're actually working on stuff that's pretty similar to what you guys are working on, issues of sustainability, and specifically related towards food justice, which is a really fascinating topic, and they're approaching it from some really interesting and multifaceted angles. So I think you'll really enjoy that, but this is part of your final. So again, I'm asking you to do your presentation, right? So that's about a 30-minute time commitment to present and do Q&A, either synchronously or asynchronously, and then an additional 30 minutes to attend a Bio 500 presentation. So I'm asking about an hour time commitment broken up total. So more on that as the schedules come out. I'll have a schedule for that posted that people can sign up for times on. Probably as early as Monday. And then, you'll be able to sign up for the Bio 500 attendance probably the following week once they've gotten theirs in. So that's all I've got for now. I know that was kind of a lot, and I know that, the way we're trying to do this final project is complicated. It is a little bit tricky, and I know that this online situation is not ideal, but I think, you know, we can make the best of it and wind up with something that's actually quite cool at the end. So for today, we are going to wrap up the week, our one video for the week. We're going to wrap it up by talking about ecological relationships within ecosystems. And so just to recap, ecology is going to be the study of interactions between biotic or living and abiotic or non-living factors. And so remembering this sort of model that we have looked at many times now throughout the year. So we have the organism, right? That's like the single guy. And then we have a population. And so we'd say that a population is a group of organisms of the same species. And what we're going to be focusing on primarily is right here, the community. So the community is many populations, so many groups of the same species interacting with each other. So there will be many groups of one species interacting with other groups of species. I think I said that weird, but it is also late here, and I think my brain is perhaps turning to mush. But we've got a lot of different dudes, a lot of different species interacting with each other in this environment. And so then the ecosystem, this is really where that word ecology comes from. That ecosystem is that interaction between all of the organisms, so all of the communities, and all of their abiotic factors as well. So what is the temperature like? What's the soil like? Are there a lot of rocks around? Like, is it wet? Is it dry? Does it get a lot of sun or no? Is it humid? Is it not? So things like that would all be what we'd call the abiotic factors. And so what are those relationships between the living and the non-living? And that's the ecosystem. And then of course the biosphere is just everything. That's the entire earth and all who inhabit it. So I'm gonna move me a little bit. Oh no, I can't. This is weird. Anyway, so ecology is important and useful, and we care about it because it helps us gain insight through a scientific method to solve environmental problems. And so this gal over here, this is Rachel Carson. She is perhaps one of the most influential ecologists, and certainly one of the most influential and famous female ecologists in history. So her deal is that she was interested, well, not even interested, she began noticing, she was a trained ecologist, she went to college, you know, studied ecology, and she started noticing that this compound that was being used in the early part of the 20th century, so around like the 40s, 50s, 60s, she starts noticing that this compound DDT that they're using, it's a pesticide, they're spraying it all around. They're, oh, throw it on some crops, kill the bugs we don't want. Oh, get rid of mosquitoes, right? And so they're throwing this DDT all around the environment, and nobody cares because it's, the 50s and nothing bad can happen when you spray chemicals on everything. But Rachel Carson starts noticing, like, there's some kind of weird stuff happening in these areas where we spray a lot of DDT. Stuff is dying. Things are being, new young organisms are being born with defects. This doesn't seem awesome. And so she writes this book called Silent Springs. This is a very famous book. It's one of those reads that you read it and you're like, this is so important, and I recognize the importance of this, but it's also a little bit dry and was definitely written in the 1960s. But if you ever get a chance to read it, please do. It is still very important and awesome. She writes this book, Silent Spring, and she basically goes, guys, what are we doing? You can't just spray junk all around. You can't just like throw chemicals into an ecosystem and think that that's going to be fine over a long period of time. And so at first, people were livid. Rachel Carson was like hunted down by agricultural folks being like, you take it back. We love spraying pesticides. take it back right now. And she said, no, I'm a scientist and I've done the science, I've done the research, and I'm not taking it back. Here's my evidence, here's my book, read it. And eventually, eventually they were won over. And now we no longer use DDT, and it is entirely thanks to Rachel Carson. So she's a very, very important figure in that way. She's also just an awesome, smart person, and that is a very cool thing to have. So the thing about ecological science, like I said, we care about it because it provides insight to these environmental problems. But what we need to recognize are the limitations of it. And those limitations are that it can inform, what actions we can take. So we can do the science, we can make the observations, and we can communicate those findings. But that research alone is not enough to solve these environmental issues. And so environmental science and ecology, in many ways, is an inherently interdisciplinary branch of biology, because it really requires cooperation between not only just the ecologists, but also folks who are capable of making that change. So political figures would be a big one. Agricultural folks, I don't know why I can't think of the name, farmers to make more sustainable choices, and so on. So community ecology, I said, is what we're going to be focusing on. So this, again, is all of the organisms that we would find in an area. So this is going to be all of your plants, all of your animals, all of your bacteria, all of your insects, everything that you would find within that area. And so we can describe a community, an ecological community, in a few different ways, but primarily we would describe it by the composition of species within it. So how much of each species it sort of exists in this space. Is it largely plant dominated? Is it not? Is it something that is inhabited primarily by bacterial and fungal species? For example, is it inhabited primarily by arthropods or other insects, and so on? And so the big question that we want to ask ourselves when we are looking at a community is, we want to say, like, how do abiotic factors, so how does all that non-living stuff, how much water there is, how humid it is, how dry it is, how much sun, all of those things, how do those abiotic factors and the way they interact with the individuals in those populations and the communities affect the composition of those communities? So how does, the temperature affect the, which plants are able to survive in that area? How does the amount of water affect which types of birds are going to want to flock to the area to feed on the fish that might be living in that water? And so we're really interested in the dynamics of these communities, and so how everybody is interacting with each other, how everybody is being friends and getting along, and also how those abiotic factors are influencing those dynamics. What we're also interested in is how variable or stable that species composition is. So if I say that, a given area, maybe this area, for example, is, it's got a lot of water, so that's one of the abiotic factors. It's also heavy in aquatic plant life, and maybe we have some fish and some arthropods hanging out in the water as well as the grassland. Is that a pretty stable composition? So what I mean by that is it roughly the same amount of plant life year round? Is it roughly the same amount of insect life and fish life year round? Or are there seasons where things are sort of booming and busting, right? So things are reproducing like crazy and there's a lot of them, and then times where there are none of them. And is that variability regular and cyclical, or is it sporadic and unpredictable? So these are all things that we really care about, because understanding them and fully grasping what those interactions are and how everything impacts each other is really going to be essential for conservation efforts. So should an issue arise where an organism within this community becomes threatened in some way, and we want to intervene to conserve that species, well, we need to understand how it interacts with all of the other components of that community. This is also really relevant for disease control in humans, if you can believe it. So one of the really classic examples is that deforestation can actually lead to a huge increase in human disease outbreaks, specifically tick-borne diseases, so things like Lyme's disease and ehrlichiosis and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, all of these tick-borne illnesses, and malaria, mosquito-borne illnesses, West Nile virus, triple E, we remember that from the fall. All of these things actually increase when we disrupt forest communities. And there's a lot of reasons for this that we'll talk about in future videos, but for right now, we'll leave that as sort of an interesting footnote. So within a community, we have what we call interspecific interactions. And so inter, remember, means like between. Intra would be the other side of that. So intra would be within. So something happening inside the body would be intra. And then inter means between. So we are looking at interactions that happen between organisms. Specifically individual single organisms within the community. And these can be either helpful, which we would denote as a plus sign, or they can be harmful, which we denote as a minus sign. And this competition is going to occur when when populations, so groups of single species, begin competing for the same resources. So something that is finite and limited. So one thing we see a lot of is competition among desert plants for sunlight. So not sunlight, there's plenty of sunlight. Water is what I meant to say. Again, it is very late here. Desert plants are going to compete for water because this is a resource within their community that is limited. So this is one of the abiotic resources that is limited. Don't get a lot of rainfall in the desert. So when they do get it, those plants that are best adapted for that environment and are best suited to access that water are the ones that are going to survive. And this is a type of competition because that amount of water is finite. It's not, it will rain again eventually, but who knows when. And so that amount of water is going to be distributed amongst the desert plants according to whichever plants are best suited to access it. And so we also have interspecific competition. I'm also just chuckling because this little guy makes me laugh every time I see this picture. This is the American crayfish. We'll talk about him in just a moment. So interspecific competition is something that is generally negative to both populations. So two populations meet each other. Remember, they're groups of different species. They meet each other within an environment. And when they begin competing for finite resources, generally speaking, both are harmed. And so we would denote this as minus sign / minus sign. And so oftentimes, though, it's not that they are equally harmed. It's usually that one is disproportionately harmed. And so whichever one is harmed more as a result of this competition with the other species, with the other population, is going to be the one that is less well suited for the environment, and may eventually be threatened or have to move on to a different environment. One of the ways that this can happen is when we actually introduce non-native species to an area. So if you've ever heard that like you shouldn't order plants online because they might carry like parasites from other countries, or I've always been told that you shouldn't order ladybugs for your garden. I don't know if anybody is like a serious gardener, but if you are a serious gardener, if your parents are serious gardeners, you may have heard of them ordering ladybugs because they're pretty good at eating certain types of bugs that can harm the plants. You can actually order ladybugs online. The issue is that often they are not true ladybugs. They're a type of beetle, the name of which I'm forgetting right now, but they're a type of beetle that looks just like a ladybug. You and I would never know the difference. But the issue is that they are an invasive species. And so they're this beetle that has originated from parts of Asia, and they kill other ladybugs and they kill other types of beetles, and they just kill all the time, and they're just making a mess of carnage in their wake, and they're the worst. And you probably see them all the time because they are super successful at breeding in this environment, as it turns out. And so what has happened is they are out competing the native species. They're sort of crowding out and overtaking the resources that that the native species originally had. They've sort of colonized this area, and so now they're actually quite common in North America. So you'll see them all the time and think it's a ladybug, but next time you see it, you'll know that it might be a little imposter. And so this very funny picture of a crayfish is here, because the American crayfish is actually an invasive species to Germany. And so Germany at one point got some crayfish there, and I'm not sure the exact story. Perhaps there was a fisherman who accidentally brought some home from a fishing trip, or perhaps somebody had a cute pet that they let go, and maybe he was a she and she had some babies, and then the species became really dominant. I'm not really sure what the story is. I'm just making up ridiculous things. But anyway, what wound up happening is the American crayfish became so populous in German waters that it wound up outcompeting and really just outcompeting other native species, and really just destroying the ecosystem as a result. As you've read with the Yellowstone wolf article, you've seen how delicate the balance of an ecosystem can be. So when you remove even one factor, or when you change a factor, the whole thing can come toppling down. It's all chain reactions. And so this is what happened with the American crayfish in certain freshwater sources in Germany. So other types of relationships between organisms, we have mutualism, and this one's kind of cool. This is when everybody wins. So both populations are going to benefit. So we denote this as ++ and examples of this are like the mycorrhizae that live on the roots of plants. So these are fungus that sort of help the plant by increasing the surface area of the roots so that they're better able to absorb water and nutrients, and also by performing a process called nitrogen fixation, which is basically when they make nitrogen from the atmosphere available for the plant. The relationship between flowers and pollinators. So all those cute wildflowers growing around, and the bees and the birds and the bats that are, dusting themselves in pollen and going around to all of the other flowers. And then the coolest one, I think, is the relationship between humans and their microbiome. So I think we may have spoken about this at one point. I'm not entirely sure. I think we may have discussed it a little bit in the fall. But the microbiome microbiome essentially is is the name we give to all of the bacteria that live in and on the human body. And so what's cool about the microbiome, just like a little bit of a side thing, what's cool about the microbiome is that everybody's is like a fingerprint. It's all totally unique. So mine is different from yours and it's different from everybody else's. And you could actually theoretically identify a person by which microbes and in what ratios we have in our bodies. And so it's its own sort of ecological community in there. It's really fascinating stuff. And there's all kinds of evidence coming out now, because this is kind of a hot area of research right now. There's all this evidence coming out right now that this is, possibly responsible for all sorts of things that we never thought, like our immune system function, perhaps even like what types of food we crave. Really interesting stuff. But so, in this case, we benefit because the bacteria helps us out. They help us digest our food. They live on our skin and help outcompete bad bacteria that could harm us. They do all sorts of nice things for us. And then for the microbes, they're having a good time because they get a free ride in a cool human, and they get to be kept at the temperature that they like. They get to be safe and protected. So it's a pretty sweet deal for both of us. Another word that you may have heard for this type of relationship is a symbiosis. So both organisms working together. And so commensalism is another type of interaction. So the word commensalism is derived from Latin words, which roughly mean to eat at the same time, which I thought was really weird, especially when you think about, certain examples of commensalist relationships. And so look at these little guys right here. So these are barnacles. So if you've ever been to a harbor, you have probably seen them hanging out on the dock. They're everywhere near the ocean. If you've been on a boat, or if you have a boat and that has been in the ocean, you've probably seen them on there. This is one that's on a whale. And so a commensalist relationship is where one party benefits, so in this case, the barnacle, and the other is unharmed. So we would denote this as a plus sign, plus sign. And so the barnacle is benefiting because he or she or they gets a free ride, and they get to travel the ocean blue and, pick up food the entire time. They like to eat plankton. And so they get to just, shovel food in their face all they want while riding on this sweet whale. And the whale doesn't care. The whale is not harmed. But the whale isn't really benefited either. It's not helpful to have barnacles all over. If it gets to be a nuisance, it could become a nuisance, could become a problem. But the barnacles are not really helping. They're not really hurting. They're just kind of there. But the barnacles are having a very good time. So we would say that that is a commensalist relationship. So competition. So I talked a little bit about this already. Competition is when two species are competing with each other. So there are limited resources accessible and available within what we call the ecological niche. And so the ecological niche is the total of all of the biotic and abiotic resources within an environment. So everything available, basically everything that an organism could possibly need for survival. That is the ecological niche that an organism occupies. And so when two organisms require the same ecological niche, they essentially need to fight for it. One of them is going to win. And so this is kind of a principle of ecology, is that two organisms cannot share the exact same niche. Either one of them is going to need to leave, essentially, and find new resources, and maybe not entirely, maybe just in part. Like, for example, maybe there is a specific type of food that both organisms eat, and they also share a specific habitat, and they also share everything else. So maybe one of them just changes their food source. That might be enough to, ensure mutual survival. But when they're both competing for the same exact thing, those resources are going to become really scarce. And that's a problem because now one of them is going to go without. And both species in this case would be benefited by not having the other one there. And so that's what's going to happen. Either one of them is going to need to die or they're going to need to leave. I would guess that most species would choose leaving. So another example of, we're getting like worse and worse as we go on. So parasitism is the next type that we'll look at. So we've probably all heard of this one before. This is defined as when one organism benefits and the other is harmed. And so the survival of the organism who is getting something positive out of this relationship pretty much always depends on the host being harmed, not because they enjoy it, right? They're just, they're just living their life. They're just trying to survive and use their available resources that they've evolved for. But their survival results in the harm of their host organism. And so invariably, the organism that they have evolved to be a parasite on is going to be harmed. And so examples of, there's a lot of examples of this. The one that I could stomach is the tick. So there's a lot of different kinds of ticks. They can be pretty good sized, to where we've probably seen them before, and they can be much, much smaller. And wouldn't you know it, most tick-borne infections, so things like Lyme's disease and ehrlichiosis, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, all those things I mentioned before, wouldn't you know it, most of them are transmitted by these little guys. This is what we call the nymph of a tick. This is why I told you when you went out for your foraging activity to roll yourself off with a sticky lint roller paper, because these little guys, these little nymphs, are so hard to see that we would miss them. And unless you're like very fair skinned and you had skin exposed that you thought to look there and they didn't wind up in your hair or something, they'd be very, very easy to miss. So you definitely want to always roll yourself off with a lint roller. That's just my side note. There is also a type of isopod. This one went around the internet a while ago. There's a type of isopod that survives by attaching to the tongues of fish species and sort of lives there. So it sort of takes place of the tongue. It's the grossest thing I've ever seen. I would thought about including an image of that, but I would probably throw up. So I did not. Instead, we get the tick. And there are many, many other examples of parasites, many of which we've probably heard of, but what's important is the concept in that one must be harmed and for the other to benefit and therefore survive. So other sort of negative relationships, sort of moving on that track, we have predation, so predator and prey relationships, and herbivory. So this is when an organism consumes plants. And so both actions are going to influence the evolution of those species. So predation is going to influence evolution by introducing natural selection into that population and sort of weeding out, we can almost think of, those organisms that are least well suited to survive that predator hunt. And so what the result is that you wind up with a population shifting so that those dominant alleles in the population those alleles within the population that protect the that protect the organism against predation are the ones that become the dominant alleles. That's what I meant to say. And so this also happens again with herbivory, right? So certain plants have evolved mechanisms that are sort of like defense strategies against organisms that would eat them, that would harm them. And so one of these examples is the passion fruit flower, actually. And I was having a really hard time finding an image of this for some reason, but essentially what happens is there is this butterfly, the heliconius, the zebra longwing. And so this guy is very, very pretty and cute, and it lays its larva on the passion flower leaf. So not the flower part, but on the leaf of the plant. And they're really, really tiny eggs, but you can see they compare it to the size of a pencil. They're really, really teeny tiny, but they have these like yellow like balls almost. And so very interestingly, and I don't know why I was having such a hard time finding a photo of this, but very interestingly, the passion flower has evolved so that sometimes the leaves will deposit packets of sugar onto the surface of the leaves. And so you're like, okay, whatever, who cares? There's sugar. But what happens is that these little pockets form of the sugar from the plant, and they turn a yellow color. Interestingly enough, a yellow color that looks a lot like this. And so they form this kind of like ovally yellow packet that resembles the larvae of this particular butterfly. And this is really important because this sends a signal to the butterfly. This is basically a trick. And this sends a signal to the butterfly that says, oh, somebody's already laid eggs here, leave this plant alone. Because when those larvae hatch, those caterpillars are going to be very hungry, and they're going to chomp, chomp, chomp all the way down those leaves. And so, not good for the plant. They need the leaves to photosynthesize and create their energy. So those larvae, are going to destroy the leaves otherwise. But if the butterfly thinks that eggs have already been laid there, it's a trick, of course, but if the butterfly thinks that there have already been eggs laid there, it's probably going to leave the plant alone and say, oops, my bad, somebody's already here. I will not lay eggs here. Therefore, my larvae will not hatch and they will not destroy your leaves. It's brilliant. Genetics is absolutely incredible. So there's also this concept of invasive species, which we sort of addressed a little bit ago. These are non-native species that, when introduced into a niche, dominate it. And so not all non-native species, when introduced to a new niche, will take over. It's hard to say what will cause a species to take over when introduced somewhere new. And so the only thing we can sort of rely on is we can say, like, okay, there are these biotic checks and balances, within an ecosystem. And those take the form of things like predation and herbivory, right? So predators hunting prey and organisms that are eating the plants. And so if you introduce, say, an invasive plant species like this guy here, this is called a knotweed. It's very prevalent around Andover. You may have seen it before. You can actually eat the young shoots. I've heard they're fairly good and they taste a little bit like asparagus. I don't know that I'd try them though, because they kind of look like wood and they have the texture of wood. So I don't actually know if they're good. But so anyway, if we don't have organisms that are going to essentially keep this new species in check, when it is introduced to the ecosystem, it could proliferate and develop and reproduce out of control and take over those resources within an environment, disrupting another species. And so knotweed in particular, this example is really interesting because this is a perennial plant. It grows fairly tall. It'll grow a couple feet tall, and it's very woody. It's a lot like bamboo, sort of, and it has these like nice leaves on it that sort of look like, they almost look like blackberry or raspberry leaves. But the problem is that if you try to get rid of it, you'll have a really hard time because the roots are very thick and very sturdy, and they are deep under the ground. And if any piece of root is left while this plant is really, really good at just popping right back up. And so you might be thinking, well, who cares? I'll just leave it. Well, this is a problem if you want to have a garden, because these things take up a lot of water use, and they also use up a lot of the soil. They're sort of tightly weaved throughout the soil. And if you like a nice lawn, which maybe there's an ecological argument for, the existence of lawns and maybe why we shouldn't just have grass. But if you want to have a nice lawn or you want to have a garden and you have knotweed there, it's going to be very, very hard for you to get it all so that it's not just popping up all the time. So that's all I got for today. That wound up being a little bit longer than I thought it was going to be, but I think that's okay. This is our one video this week. So if you have any questions, please come see me. I would love to see your face, and you can pop by conference period or let me know that you've got some questions and would like to check in. In the meantime, start working on your projects. I will be giving you guys sort of guidelines for the next few weeks as we're wrapping this up on sort of where you should be in this, because I know this is probably not your only final project, and there's sort of a lot going on with this one. So keep me posted if you need any clarification or guidance with getting that together. And otherwise, I will see you Monday. We'll talk more about it then.